Okay, my presentation is on dissociative amnesia, which falls under the dissociative disorders within the DSM-5. Dissociative disorders are characterized by a disruption and/or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. Symptoms can disrupt every area of psychological functioning. Symptoms include unbidden intrusions into awareness and behavior with accompanying losses of continuity and subjective experience, basically meaning that there are lapses in memory from within the person. There's also an inability to access information or to control mental functions that normally are readily amenable to access or control. Trauma and dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders are usually linked to some sort of trauma, and many symptoms are influenced by the proximity to the trauma. 3 types of dissociative disorders are depersonalization and derealization, dissociative amnesia, which is the one I am covering, and dissociative identity disorder. In depersonalization and derealization, a person usually feels they are numb and detached from oneself. They usually feel the world around them is not real. This is when someone feels like they are an outsider with respect to one's thoughts, feelings, and actions. And this is usually where you would hear someone say, I feel like I'm watching myself from outside of myself. In dissociative amnesia, this is when they have an inability to recall important personal information which would not be lost with ordinary forgetting. They usually black out information about themselves. In dissociative identity disorder, usually a person has 2 or more distinct personality identities, and this is used to cope with bad memories or traumas that they would like to forget. In the DSM-5, they have trauma-related disorders and dissociative disorders next to one another to reflect the close relationship between the diagnostic classes, because they typically do share aspects of one another. Acute stress disorder and PTSD contain dissociative symptoms such as amnesia, flashbacks, numbing, and depersonalization and derealization. Characteristics of dissociative amnesia are an inability to recall autobiographical information. And amnesia can be split up into these categories. Localized, which is a failure to recall events during a specific time. This would be the most common form. In selective, they recall some but not all parts of the event that happened. In generalized, they have a complete loss of memory for one's life history, and this is the rarest form. Some lose previous knowledge and may forget their identity. This oftentimes has acute onset and usually gets attention of police or emergency services because these are the kinds of people that you see walking around aimlessly, not really having a set identity within themselves. And examples of this would be like a combat veteran. In systematized loss of memory, there's a loss of memory for a specific category of information. In continuous, they forget new events as they occur. They may or may not involve fugue, which is a sudden, unexpected, purposeful travel away from home, and this can occur with 1 or more amnesia episodes, and they oftentimes do assume a new identity. Dissociative amnesia is said to be like having amnesia for their amnesia because they don't usually realize that they do have this loss in memory until someone brings about new information about an event or talk about an event and they realize that they don't have any recall for the event. Criteria for this disorder includes an inability to recall important autobiographical information, usually of a traumatic or stressful nature, that is inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. Symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Disturbance cannot be explained by physiological effects of a substance or a neurological or other medical condition. The disturbance is not better explained by dissociative identity disorder, PTSD, acute stress disorder, somatic symptom disorder, or major or mild neurocognitive disorder. Associated features with this disorder include chronically impaired in their ability to form and sustain satisfactory relationships. This is because when a person does not recall their identity, it's difficult for them to connect with the person that they were before their dissociative amnesia occurred. Most often, history of trauma, child abuse, and victimization are common with a person who has dissociative amnesia. Some may report flashbacks, and many have a history of self-mutilation, suicide attempts, and other high-risk behaviors. Depressive and functional neurological symptoms, depersonalization, autohypnotic symptoms, and high hypnotizability are associated with this disorder as well. Development of dissociative amnesia. Usually the onset of generalized amnesia is usually sudden, and less is known about the onset of localized and selective amnesias because they are rarely evident. Onset of localized amnesia may be delayed for hours, days, or even longer. Individuals may report multiple episodes, and during these episodes, a person may appear to be acutely symptomatic. During the duration of the forgotten events, they may last from minutes to decades. So it's a very wide span of how long a person can be in this dissociative state. As amnesia remits, there may be considerable distress. Dissociative amnesia has been observed across all ages, and it is particularly difficult to diagnose children because of issues with communication about amnesia between client and therapist. The therapist may not know how to communicate the question about the event, and the child may not understand. Risk factors for this disorder include anyone who has single or repeated traumatic experiences, and this can include war, childhood maltreatment, natural disasters, genocide, sexually based offenses, anything like that can make someone at a greater risk for having dissociative amnesia, or it is consistent with someone who does. This disorder is more likely to occur with someone who has greater number of adverse childhood experiences, physical or sexual abuse, interpersonal violence, increased severity, frequency, and violence of the trauma. Removal from traumatic circumstances may return memory, and this will alternate with amnesia for the content of the flashbacks. Cultural consideration for this disorder would be that in Asia, Middle East, and Latin America, non-epileptic seizures and other functional neurological symptoms may accompany dissociative amnesia. In strict cultures and restrictive social traditions, the precipitants of dissociative amnesia often do not involve frank trauma, but they do involve severe psychological stresses or conflict. And examples of these would be marital conflict, other family disturbances, attachment problems, and conflicts due to restriction or oppression. As dissociative amnesia begins to remit, a wide variety of affective phenomena may surface, such as dysphoria, grief, rage, shame, guilt, psychological conflict and turmoil, suicidal and homicidal ideations, impulses, and acts. Many individuals with this disorder have symptoms that meet diagnostic criteria for comorbid somatic disorders, personality disorders, depressive disorders, and/or PTSD. Dissociative amnesia has its origins from hysteria, which is a poorly misunderstood and misconceived notion. Freud and Janet were deeply influenced by dissociative phenomena and created their own theories of the mind. The surfacing of dissociative disorders in psychiatry has allowed for understanding these often misdiagnosed disorders. In the trauma model, dissociation is a psychobiological state or trait that functions as a protective response to traumatic or overwhelming experiences. Dissociation is most commonly conceptualized as a continuum from normal to pathological. In the fantasy model, dissociation is a cognitive trait that leads to fantasies. In the article by Lowenstein, 2018, higher dissociation scores were strongly linked to acute or chronic traumatic experiences. Treatment of this disorder mainly focuses on relieving symptoms and realigning the individual with their memories. They also focus on developing coping skills, getting back to normal functioning, and improving relationships. Specifically, psychotherapy, which is the most common form to treat dissociative amnesia, focuses on encouraging communication of traumatic events and increasing insight into their problems. For cognitive behavioral therapy, this focuses on dysfunctional thinking patterns and feelings and works on appropriate ways to discuss these. In dialectical, this is mainly for severe personality disturbances and it usually takes place after trauma. In clinical hypnosis, they focus on relaxation, concentration, and focused attention to achieve a different state of consciousness and allows exploration of these hidden emotions, feelings, and memories. And they try to bring them into light, hence into consciousness. So here I linked a story about a newlywed husband who forgot pretty much everything that had to do with the wedding. So he forgot his wife, the wedding itself, and even being a husband. It's a pretty interesting case and aligns well with dissociative amnesia. So this concludes my presentation and hope you enjoyed.